Thanks so much for the introduction, Robin, and thank you, Sandy, for taking over this series. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Henry Sauermann. He is a professor of strategy at ESMT Berlin, where he also serves as a director of the Institute for Endowment Management and Entrepreneurial Finance and the chair in entrepreneurship. In his research, Henry studies the role of human capital in science, innovation, and entrepreneurship, particularly how scientists' motive and incentives affect innovation, career choice, and entrepreneurship. And today, Henry will be discussing the role of joiners in the entrepreneurial process. He will also talk about promising opportunities for studying joiners as an important type of entrepreneurial human capital. Go ahead, Henry.
Well, thank you so much, Wesley and Sandy, for hosting. It's great to have two of you and not only one. Thank you everyone for joining. I look forward to sharing some of this research, and also we're going to leave some time in the end to have discussions, because I'm just as interested in hearing what you all think, what the new questions might be, how you might be working in this area, as I'm interested in sharing our research with you. So I'm not going to give a particular paper, but I thought it's going to be a good idea to summarize kind of some broader themes in that area of startup joiners. Because I think, it's something that people haven't studied as much as other aspects in entrepreneurship, but that it offers a lot of opportunities to do future work. And this is mostly research done with Mike Roach, who was a PhD colleague of mine back at Duke, and who we still are working with now for quite a long time now. So let me motivate this whole thing by showing you two pictures. So this is one picture, and in a classroom, I would ask you to guess who that is. So I'll give you a second to guess, but you don't have to type it in. Guess who that is. And here's the answer. It is the Apple team. It's the original Apple team. You see Steve Jobs in the middle here, arguing with some of the others. But there's a bunch of people and a bunch of machines in the background as well. Let's do one more of this. Who is this one? This is Microsoft. First 11 members. You see Bill Gates somewhere, the little kid down here. And you see Paul Allen over here. And again, it's a team of people, even though most of our thinking about Apple and Microsoft really focuses on the original founders. And this is kind of where we're coming from in this stream of research, to say that there's all this research on founders, which is important. Without these founders, we could not have these companies, and much of the success clearly depends on them. And so obviously there's a lot of research in economics on entrepreneurship, in sociology, and organizational behavior, in strategy, and this is clearly really important. But there's very little attention to all these other people who are joining the founders as they're starting the ventures. And so this is what we are going to focus on today. And that's what Mike and I have been focused on for the last couple of years. So let me just give you a summary of some of the big questions we've been asking. And I'll walk you in this talk today very briefly through some of the studies that we've done to address these questions. So if you think about it, before anything happens, there are some people who are interested in joining companies that are new startups or ventures. And so one question is, who ex ante is actually interested in doing this kind of thing? And then there is this question of, well, how is the process happening that people who are interested actually get into startups? Well, what role does the market play? How do they sort with respect to different characteristics? How can we understand this kind of entry decision and entry process as people are moving into startups? And then finally, what are the differences that emerge due to these processes? And do these differences actually matter? Does it matter that the people who go to startups are maybe different from the founders or from regular employees who are working for established firms? So this timeline is a very kind of coarse and crude one, but really what it tries to express is that we're looking at both prior to entry in the organization, who are these people, where are they coming from, what shapes their entrepreneurial preferences, how do they get into startups, and what implications does their performance and activity have once they're in the startups. So let me kind of focus first on this one, which is who is attracted to startup employment even before they've joined. And this is a paper that Mike and I wrote a couple of years ago, which really for us was the first kind of dip into this kind of realm of joiners, and to say, well, who are these people? What does it really mean? Is this a different thing from the founders and established firm employees that people have discussed before? And this is also the setup, if you want, of that paper. It's really picking up in the existing literature at that time, which said, well, let's focus on the founders and let's put everybody else in this kind of big bucket of established firm employees. Founders, as you well know, this is about the people who have entrepreneurial opportunities, who exploit those opportunities. And there's a huge amount of literature studying their characteristics, such as, they get a lot of autonomy, they take more risks, There's task variety associated with it. So this role of a founder is pretty well defined in the literature, and we have some sort of image as who are the people who would be doing this. And on the other hand, you have the traditional employee literature, established firm employees. The idea is, well, these are people who work for established organizations, especially as these organizations are large. There's bureaucratic structure, there's specialization, but there's also stability, job security, and these people get paid quite a bit of money, and much research points to these people getting paid more money than the entrepreneurs, except for outliers, obviously, and there's a big literature trying to really understand what the difference between the founders and the established firm employees is. What we are doing in that paper is saying, well, there's something that's missing, and that is these, what we call joiners, which are these people who are attracted to working in startups, but not as the founders, but they also don't want to work in established firms that are kind of larger and older. So these people, when you think about their role they're playing, is really about also being exposed to some of the risk and task variety that founders are exposed to, but maybe less so. And they also have probably less autonomy than the founders. And also quite important is that they do not have to have an opportunity on their own. So founders need to have an opportunity to found, joiners do not. They just need to see a startup somewhere or get together with a founder and exploit the opportunity that's offered by the founder. So this is kind of focusing on the role that these different people play in the exposed market, so to speak. And what we do in the paper is trying to understand who is attracted to these different roles, who wants to be a founder, who wants to be an established firm employee, and who wants to be a joiner, and is there anything unique and special about this attraction to being a joiner? So in that paper, we are focusing on two different prior literatures that tell us how we could understand these antecedents of joiner preferences. And one is the stereotypical economics view, where it's mostly an individual perspective, and it's typically focusing on individual preferences for factors such as risk aversion, autonomy, or financial gain. And we've, I've mentioned earlier some of the studies that have really give us a big understanding of how founders differ with respect to some of these characteristics. There's also another literature, and that's more sociological in nature, which has looked at the influence of social context, of role models, of norms, in shaping people's decisions to join, not to join, but to actually found companies. So a lot of the literature on the peer effects, for example, in entrepreneurship has pursued that perspective. In this paper, we are acknowledging that both of these might be important, and we are developing some discussion as to how they jointly might actually influence people's attraction to being a founder or to being a joiner, or to not wanting to do anything with entrepreneurship, but rather go into established firms, for example. And there's obviously much more discussion behind this that you can read up on the paper, but the basic idea is that both a strong entrepreneurial context, such as founder role models or very strong norms to found, as well as very strong preferences for entrepreneurial job attributes, think about risk and autonomy, may push people towards having a founder interest. And the joiner interest we hypothesize here is really somewhere in the middle, where you have maybe some sort of encouragement of entrepreneurship, but it's not as strong as you need to found your own company, but also as you might have some preferences for autonomy and risk, but you're not quite as extreme on those dimensions as what turns out to be the founder types. So in some sense, two contributions here. One is really thinking about the two different mechanisms and two different dimensions along which these preferences could be developing, but also thinking about the joiner interest as kind of an intermediate position between the typical dichotomy of founders versus traditional employees. So that's kind of the theory, if you want. And again, there's more of that in the paper. What we then do is we look at survey data from PhD level scientists and engineers, people who are still training in those roles. And we look at what their career aspirations and preferences actually are. So to give you some background, we ran a survey starting in 2010 of 30,000 PhD students and postdocs at US universities. In this study here, focus on 4,000 people who are close to graduation because we want to see what their next plans essentially are. And we also complemented the survey data with interviews that we did with PhD students, advisors, as well as startup founders and joiners. So this survey, we call it the Science and Engineering PhD Panel Survey because we also keep doing it, is then kind of an interesting setting because again, we look at people who are prior to entering any kind of organization. So it's really much more about this kind of ex ante selection and about the initial formation of preferences that is not yet shaped by maybe other organizations they've worked for in the past. We also think this is useful because we know that graduate education is a strong period of socialization. So a lot of these preferences may be shaped during that time. And we believe this is generalizable to highly educated individuals in general, but we are not arguing that this necessarily applies to low-tech or lower education people. So in some sense, we are recognizing this might be a specific context, but it's also, I think, a very important context because many startups rely on highly trained scientists and engineers to get their work done. So let me just briefly mention some of the key measures. One is, do you want to be a founder? Do you plan to start your own company? If people say they do that with a 4 to 5 on a 5-point scale, we code them as founder. Interest, joiner interest is putting job availability aside. How attractive do you personally find a career in a startup with an emphasis on research and development? If they say this is super interesting and super attractive to them, we found them as a joiner. Everybody else here is coded as an established firm interest person or as someone with an academic interest. We also have individual preferences for specific job attributes such as autonomy, wealth, career advancement, work activities related to commercialization, management, and so on. And we have a risk measure that's based on typical lottery measures. We also measure contextual factors. Remember, we try to understand to what extent social factors may also shape preferences. So there we ask about departmental norms regarding academic and startup careers. And we also ask whether the advisor of the PhD student has actually founded a startup in the past. So that's kind of a role model proxy. And we have a bunch of control variables that you can see in the paper. So let me just show you 2 key results. One is the results with respect to these preferences for different kinds of job attributes. So this figure here shows you essentially the 4 different kinds of preference outcomes that we're looking at. Do you want to be a founder? Do you have a joiner interest, an established firm interest, or an academic interest? And we are showing in that figure how these different types of people differ with respect to these micro-level preferences for autonomy, income, risk, commercialization activities, and management. And what you see is that the founders, consistent with much of the literature on founders, have a very high risk tolerance compared to others, are interested in commercializing technologies, and are interested in doing management as well, which is a little bit related to the Desir idea of maybe a diversity of different tasks. Joiners are less pronounced on these different dimensions, but it becomes more interesting to compare them to established firm employees and people who want to go into academia, where you see relative to academic types and established firm types, joiners also express higher risk tolerance or interest in commercialization and management as well. So the point here is we see differences in these micro-level preferences across all the different types of people, and depending on whether you compare the joiner types with people who are interested in founding or academics, it looks a little bit different. But to our kind of perspective, joiners really are different from both founder types, but also from established firm employee types. Now, this is the individual preferences, so more the econish perspective. Here is the social perspective, which was founder role models and entrepreneurial norms, if you remember. And there we find that both of them actually are related to joiner preferences, but the founder role models actually primarily predict founder preferences. So if you have an advisor who is a founder themselves, him or herself, you're more likely to express a preference to actually start your own company, whereas general entrepreneurial norms, which means the degree to which the department encourages people to go into entrepreneurship, actually relates to entrepreneurship in the form of joining rather than necessarily founding. And our interpretation is that role models have very strong social influence, whereas entrepreneurial norms are somewhat weaker, so it doesn't push people quite to the level of founding, but to the level of potentially joining. But most interestingly, given that we look at both the preference-based or the kind of micro-preference-based and the social components, both of them are actually adding up and reinforcing. So if you get both entrepreneurial role models, for example, and you have strong risk preferences, for example, then you're really being much more likely to express the desire to found. So to summarize this paper, first, we try to put on the map that there are these joiner types, so people who explicitly want to join startups, but not as founders, and they're also not as interested in working in established firms. And in terms of numbers, the number of those people in our paper is actually much larger than the number of people who want to found their own companies. We also find that joiner types differ significantly from both the founder types and the established firm types. And to some extent, these joiner preferences are explained by micro-preferences for job attributes such as risk, autonomy, and management, but also by social factors, especially entrepreneurial norms. Now, this is kind of interesting. We like this paper, and I think it was important for us to kind of conceptualize joiners in that paper. But ultimately, you may ask, well, does it matter? Does it matter that people have these ex-ante preferences to join startups? Does it actually relate to what they do later on? So that is then the next paper that I'm going to briefly tell you about, relating to this question of what shapes the transitions of people into startups. And as a result, how do the populations of people in startups actually differ from the people who move into other kinds of firms? So this is still work in progress. But here the question is set up a little bit differently, given that we've seen so much discussion in the press of saying, oh, startups really have a hard time hiring because they have to constantly compete with big established firms who have much more money, who have much more resources. And at this point, this is the Googles and the Ubers who used to be startups, but now they're big established firms. And there's a big concern that startups have a hard time attracting human capital because these large firms have so many benefits to offer to their potential employees. So in this paper, we are really focusing on this question: can startups actually hire high ability individuals? And how does it relate both to the high ability, but also to potential preferences that people may express for different types of careers? So starting with the first one, if you think about the traditional economics view of why people sort into different kind of firms, very often the underlying assumption is this is related to income maximization, and underlying that a maximization of productivity. So high ability people should go to the firms that offer a lot of work kind of context that makes them very productive, and then through rent sharing they should be able to earn a lot of money. And this is why high ability people should go to the better kind of firms. And if we think about the difference between early stage startups and established firms, very often startups have limited resources. They don't have a lot of equipment, for example, to make you a productive scientist. They also don't have the money to pay you very high wages, which means traditional theories focusing purely on productivity and income would predict that high ability people should actually go to established firms. And there's quite a bit of discussions arguing that this is what we actually see in the data as well. On the other hand, if you remember the paper I just discussed, there could clearly be people who say, well, I still want to work in startups. There's something else other than money that I like about the startup context. And this could relate to these non-financial attributes that I mentioned earlier, such as autonomy, task variety, or maybe even some greater preference for risk. And this is obviously a larger literature on economics again as well, that has looked at various types of preferences and how they affect sorting as well. For this paper here, we are not focusing on the specific job attributes such as autonomy and risk, but we are using the measures essentially from the prior paper, really aggregating some of these various things into founder types, which means people who express an intention to found, joiner types, which is people who prefer employment in startups rather than in established firms, and established firm types, which are people who prefer established firm employment rather than going to startups or founding their own companies. So if we put these two things together, both the traditional view of high ability people should go to the more resource rich large established firms versus the preference sorting theories that we have, we can see that ability and preferences should actually be reinforcing for people who are high ability, but also are established firm types, because they get the best of both worlds by going to established firms. They like that context anyways, and they could be more productive and make more money in established firms. On the other hand, ability and preferences could be offsetting and create a trade-off for high ability found on genre types. So people who are intrigued by the startup environment, but who are high ability, and the ability should pull them into the resource-rich large established firms, but the non-pecuniary job attributes should pull them into startups. So this is actually the most interesting group for us, because to some extent we try to understand, are those the people who might potentially be willing to go to startups, even though the resources are not as great, and even though the money might not be as great, because they have these non-financial benefits. So we look at this using an extension of the data I introduced earlier. So the Science and Engineering Panel Survey that we started in 2010, we kept observing people every 2-3 years, and which means that we now have some people where we know what they look like as PhD students, and then we see them again after graduation. So in this paper here, we look at 2,300 individuals who were PhD students in the first panel, and then they graduated, moved into industry employment in either startups or established firms. So for this paper, we are going to ignore everybody who stays in academia as a postdoc or wants to be a faculty member. So we measure various kind of key constructs. Obviously, one is founder types. which again is people who expressed prior to graduation an interest in founding, joiner types who prior to graduation expressed a greater preference for joining than for established firms, and established firms types, which are people who expressed a greater interest in going to an established firm than joining or founding a company. As our proxy for ability, we use the ranking of the PhD program from the National Research Council. And this is a more fine-grained measure than the typical, are you a PhD or a master's, which has been used in a lot of prior studies. But at the same time, we acknowledge it's a department level measure, if you want, rather than a purely individual level measure. And we have a number of controls, such as demographic characteristics, region, general labor demand, VC funding in the country, and so on. So let me show you just two results. As I mentioned, this is still work in progress. One is that contrary to the expectation of the traditional kind of complementary assets productivity literature, we see that high ability individuals tend to sort into startups rather than established firms. So if you just look at the left panel, you see that out of the highest quartile of ability, which means the top 25% of the people, 17% actually join startups, which compares to only about 10% of the people in the lower ability quartile who also go into startups. So startups predominantly draw from the top of the distribution in ability. The second finding is that ex-ante career preferences are a strong predictor of sorting. So as you might have expected, people who say, prior to graduation, and this is like 2 or 3 years prior to us seeing them actually going into these jobs, 27% of people who say they want to found go to startups rather than established firms. 23% of joiner types go to startups rather than established firms, which compares to only 7% of established firm types, which is people who 3 years earlier told us they would rather be in established firms. They typically do go to established firms, not to startups. So very strong preference sorting, but also ability sorting, and the ability sorting somewhat counterintuitively, not as predicted going to big firms, but to startups. So what we try to do is to understand what's happening there. One thing that we do is look at actually data from the job market process itself. So we know from the survey, from the follow-up survey, which jobs individuals actually applied for. And we also know which kinds of companies they got offers from. So whether they got offers from startups and whether they got offers from established firms. And what we find is that career preferences primarily shape what jobs people apply for, right? So you see here, clearly founder and joiner types are much more likely to apply to startup jobs than established firm types, for example. What we also see is that ability does not seem to have much of an impact on whether people apply to startups or established firms. It primarily has an impact on whether they receive an offer from startups. And it may be intuitive, but it kind of is interesting given that earlier the discussion in the public literature says, oh, startups have a really hard time finding good people. It seems that there are a lot of people actually applying for startup jobs, and that startups are able to actually cherry pick from the higher end of the ability distribution. And you saw that earlier in the distribution of ability. So there seem to be enough people in at least our sample who have interest in joining startups, joiner types, founder types, or who are somewhat indifferent between whether they go to established firms or startup, that they apply and that startups actually can cherry pick. Now we also see that joiner types and anybody actually who works in startups literally does get paid less. So there's a wage gap of 15 to 20% compared to similarly able people working in established firms. We also do robustness checks looking at stock options, other things. So there's very strong evidence that people in startups earn less financial compensation, certainly in terms of current compensation. And again, this would predict in traditional economics models, while they should not be doing this, they should go to established firms. And we argue once you put it together with the compensating differentials literature, the story is really one of startups offering less pay, but offering some non-financial benefits that are appealing not to everyone, but to startup types, people who have preferences for autonomy and risk, for example. And that is why they're able to actually attract people even at lower pay, even high ability people, and can cherry pick to get a pretty strong human capital base to work on cutting edge technologies. So this is preliminary results again from that paper, trying to move that second step from we know ex ante people have preferences. Does it play out in the job market? And the answer is yes, it does. And it probably explains why even at low pay, some very high ability people go into startups. Now, do such preferences matter even more? Do they matter not only for whether people go to startups, but even what they do once they're there? And that is the third paper that I briefly want to introduce. How do characteristics of joiners affect performance, mobility, and other outcomes? Right now, I'm going to focus just on performance, which is clearly an important one. And this is a paper that really looks at the differences between startup and established firm employees once we see them in their jobs, and how does that relate actually to the performance they're generating in the R&D context. And again, just as a reminder, you see the little team here at Microsoft. We now have a better understanding based on the two papers I just presented, what these people look like, kind of where they come from, and that it reflects, to some extent, their ability, but also especially their preferences. And so the intuition is that we know these people are somewhat different, and especially different with some of these preferences for non-financial job attributes like intellectual challenge, autonomy, or risk. And we also know from the literature, especially in creativity and organizational behavior, that some of these preferences, such as risk-taking and autonomy, can be related to innovative performance and creativity. So Teresa Amabile, among others, has done a great body of work kind of showing that some of these characteristics predict creativity and performance. And if we put it together, the intuition is that, well, if these people are different with respect to some of these motives or preferences, and if startups have more of these people, then maybe that also generates different levels of performance, even controlling for ability. And so to look at that, what I did is use a different data set. So that's not the SEPS panel survey, but this is data from the National Science Foundation, the CSTAT data system. And that essentially is a very, very large survey that the NSF runs every couple of years of a representative sample of all the scientists and engineers working in the US at different levels, bachelor's, master's, and PhD level. So they are NSF, so they get much better response rates than we would be getting. So that's 60 to 80%. In this paper, I'm going to work just with people who work full-time in firms. So again, we ignore academics. And we only look at people who work in research development, design, and computer applications, which means in R&D, because we're going to use patents as a measure of performance. Here, the sample includes bachelor's, master's, and PhD recipients. Total sample of this study is over 10,000 people. So the motives, again, these are kind of similar to what in the other paper we call preferences for job attributes. Really, the question that the survey has that we have to use here is, when thinking about a job, how important is each of the following factors to you? And you see similar ones as we discussed in the other papers: job security, pay, independence, responsibility, and intellectual challenge. The premise in this paper, and that's very important in this paper because it's cross-sectional data in principle, is that these motives are sufficiently stable that we can argue that the motives shape performance. So they're relatively stable individual level traits, or they are very, kind of formed early in life. And there is research on this one, for example, looking at twin studies to see to what extent your parents, your genetics shape some of these preferences. There's other work showing that, yes, these preferences may change, but they change very early in life, in the schools, for example, or through parenting effects. And then after that, they actually remain quite stable. And that's a kind of popular study by Halabi. At the same time, the paper clearly recognizes that this is not necessarily perfectly exogenous. And there's some robustness checks in the paper looking at, for example, validating the stability over time, looking at the time that people have spent in particular types of companies. We measure performance using patent applications, as I mentioned earlier, and we look at different types of firms. Clearly, the question is, startup employees, do they differ from established small and established large firms? So startups here defined as 5 years and less than 100 employees. Established small firms, which is older than 5 years, but still 100 employees or less, and established large firms are large and established. I drop in that paper young and large firms because they're not really young and large firms. They're typically spin-offs, which from an organizational theory perspective are actually more like old firms, right? So that they're not going to be in this paper. And lots of controls because this survey, the CSTAT data, has a lot of interesting, rich elements to it. So here's one of the key results, which is the difference across firm types in the motives of the employees. So are startup employees different from established small firm employees or established large firm employees? And in this figure, I'm doing it by comparing each of these motives relative to security motives. Security motives because risk aversion is kind of the main thing that's probably going to be different. And the reviewers proposed that, so that's what I did. But essentially, you see that in startups, employees find salary more important than job security. And they find independence much more important than job security, and they find intellectual challenge much more important than job security. If you look at established large firm employees, you find that they find salary about as important as job security, that they find independence less important than security, that they find responsibility or a broad range of tasks much less important than security, and challenge a little bit more important than security, but much less so than the startup employees. And the established small firms are somewhere in the middle. And they are somewhat less interesting because most of the traction and most of the interesting discussion nowadays is about startups versus established large firms, the Googles of the world, if you want. Now, these differences in motives are kind of the starting point. So that validates some of the stuff that we've seen in the other two papers, which was about selection into these firms. This validates again, yes, once you look at people who are working in these firms, you still see these differences in these preferences for different job attributes. But again, the point of this paper is really to say, well, does that matter for anything else? Does that matter for performance? And so what we do is to look at performance across firm types. And this is the base model, essentially looking at the patent applications. And these are incident rate ratios. That means 1 means no difference. Lower than 1 means it's less, fewer patents per person. Bigger than 1 would mean more patents per person. What you see here is that compared to startup employees, employees in established large firms have about 30% fewer patent applications, and people in established small firms have about half as many patent applications. So using this particular measure of innovative performance is lower in established large and established small firms. This is per se interesting, but it's not the focus of the paper. The question is really, to what extent may that be driven by the fact that the startup employees have different preferences, that they are more risk taking, that they have stronger preferences for autonomy, and so on. So what I do is essentially include these measures into the regression in a sense of kind of a mediation analysis. And let's focus on model 2 first, which says that the preference of job security has a negative effect on, or negative relationship with patent output. Remember, these are incidence rate ratios, so smaller than 1 means negative. Importance of salary doesn't seem to do anything. People who have a stronger preference for independence or have higher patent applications, responsibility doesn't do anything. Higher importance of challenge is associated also with a much larger patent count. Once we even include hours worked, because startup employees actually tend to report a larger number of hours worked, we then can go back to the differences in performance across firm types, which are the first 2 sets of variables. And we see that the initial gap that was pretty large in the regression model 1 has been considerably reduced. So an established large firm, now the difference in performance is not 30%, but it's only 15% left. And established small firms, somewhat less of a change, but from essentially being 52% less productive people there, they're now about 45% less productive. And I do a number of other analyses, including formal mediation analysis, showing that these changes are actually statistically significant, especially the one of the established large firm coefficient. Now, this analysis, which you can see in the paper, shows that this is primarily driven by the desire for job security. As we saw earlier, people in startups care less about job security than people in established firms. As we see in model 2, job security has a negative relationship with innovative performance, which means that to some extent, the higher patent output in startups may be due to the fact that the people who are in startups are more risk-taking, if you want, and risk-taking is associated with better performance. Let me summarize this one. Employees in startups differ from those in established firms with respect to their motives, especially lower concern with job security. And in some sense, this is important for this paper, but it's also a nice validation of the other papers which have looked at some of these differences ex ante. For example, the Joyner paper number 1, which has said, oh, people who care more about job security are less likely to express Joyner preferences. Now we see that ex post, looking at a sample of employees, this matches up. Yes, we do see that there is less of a concern with job security, even ex post. We also saw in that paper that there are significant differences in individual level performance. And I didn't show that to you here, but it's in the paper. When you actually split up the startup dummy into the fact that startups are both young and small, we see that the performance differences really relate to firm age rather than size. So it's not that small firms are more productive than large firms, but it's really young firms are more productive than old firms. And this is kind of important because much of the literature in economics that has studied innovation tends to use size measures, partly because that's much more readily available in data sets. But if you think about innovative performance, it's really important to think about the age dimension just as much. And I think for much of the research in the entrepreneurship domain, it's good to put them together and really think about small young firms as a unique thing rather than separating age and size and looking at their independent effects. And then finally, given these two prior findings, the final finding is that the differences in motives, especially the lower concern with job security, are related to differences in performance across the firm types. Again, security motives show the biggest difference between the types of employees, but also the strongest relationship with performance. In supplementary analyses, I show that this is mostly selection to the extent that I can tell, and there's very little evidence of treatment due to the startup context. The alternative explanation being that once you're in a startup, you realize this is a really risky job. I should not pay attention to job security. This is not what seems to be going on, given that I don't see much of a difference in these risk preferences over time as people, different cohorts of people. And again, reinforced by the findings from the other papers showing that ex ante concern with risk, for example, predicts preferences for joining, but also in paper number 2, predicts whether you actually join a startup or not. So just to summarize again what the journey was today, we started from ex ante considerations to say, prior to people going on the job market at all, can we already detect differences and can we see different preferences for careers in startups versus founders or being in established firms? The answer is yes. Do these preferences shape transitions into startups or established firms? The answer is yes. Quite a bit of sorting by preferences, but there's also sorting by ability, and there's some interesting kind of joint effects of ability and preferences at the same time. How do startups employees differ from other kinds of employees? They do differ to some extent with respect to ability, but primarily also with respect to preferences, for example, preferences for autonomy and job security. And do these characteristics have implications for performance or other outcomes? The third paper suggests yes, they do. And in that particular paper, the evidence is that these preference differences may relate to differences in the innovative performance as measured by patents. All right, so let me conclude a little bit and then move into our discussion by highlighting a couple of potential topics for future work. I think one is that we took a very individual kind of level perspective because we mostly kind of build on data from individual people as they're moving through their education job market process into their jobs. But it's really kind of would be nice to know more about the process by which all of this happens. So what does the labor market actually look like? How do startup jobs and people find each other? How do jobs get allocated to people or vice versa? And one question that always comes up when we talk about these issues is, what is the role of kind of formal versus informal mechanisms? So we know that, and you all know that when you work, if you work at universities that have career fairs, for example, very often the large firms have big HR departments who go out and recruit at universities, and that is also certainly true for engineering and science schools. But startups may not have that. Startups do not have the time to go to career fairs. And there's other mechanisms. Maybe it's social networks. Maybe it's informal accidents that are happening. Maybe it's also much more related to proximity in certain geographic regions like Silicon Valley. So I think it would be really interesting to learn more about what these kind of mechanisms look like. Related to that, in the papers that I presented today, we were not able to really look at the matching between individuals and very specific firms. So it's all about different types of firms, startups or established firms. So it would be great to have more research that has job offers, for example, or job position postings, and can look at, well, who matches up with whom, which kind of people go to Google, which people go to Amazon, and what are some of the differences even within the buckets of startups or the buckets of established firms. And then related to the second paper I briefly mentioned, would be nice to kind of understand even more how the competition between startups and established firms play out. What are the pros and cons of each one from the perspective of workers, but also some of the instruments that startups and established firms may be using to attract high ability human capital. And that clearly is important when we think about economic growth, when we think about giving, the resources that entrepreneurs need to create teams, to grow their companies. So I think this question of competition is important. And going back to some of the newspaper clippings I showed earlier, there's also a concern, obviously, that some of the very large technology companies have so many resources, think the Googles, think the Amazons, that they may undermine the opportunities for startups to hire. Our paper suggests there is something that's offsetting, which is startup preferences, but clearly it's more important to understand how far that competition goes. The second interesting aspect that I think one could study is what are the dynamics between founders and joiners? So most of our kind of framing is around the differences. So joiners have different career preferences. They have different preferences for risk and autonomy than the founders, for example. But in the startup, they have to work together. And maybe it's good that they're different because there's better division of labor, and it's, the joiners are fine not having as much autonomy, for example, as the founders. But there could also be frictions because of these different preferences or goals. And so it would be really cool to think about not just entrepreneurial teams in general, which we know has been done, but really think specifically about the differences between these two types of entrepreneurial actors and to see how they relate to the team dynamics. And then another question that's interesting is going really much more dynamic and thinking, moving beyond this initial kind of job search and job choice and seeing them once they go in the companies, which is what I presented, what happens as companies actually grow? Because if our story is correct, and if people have a very strong preference, especially for startups, for their small size, for their young age, for the organizational characteristics of startups specifically, then these people should not like the fact that startups become big and bureaucratic. And there's now some emerging research as to, what does it imply for turnover, for employee exits, for example. And I think that would be really interesting to kind of pursue that further, building on this conceptualization of joiners specifically and of the specific characteristics of joiners. And relatedly, you know the literature on acqui-hiring that big firms are buying up startups partly for the human capital. This essentially means we have taken joiners who were happy in their startups, moved them into big established firms, which our theory predicts they will not like because there's a mismatch now in terms of the career preferences and the organizational context. And there would be some interesting implications again for mobility, for performance that one could study. And then maybe given especially this audience here, I think this is broader than just startups in the sense that I think all these papers have highlighted the importance of thinking about non-financial preferences or preferences in a more general sense. And I propose to really think about human capital to not only as IQ and experience and ability, but to think about human capital as the people, also consisting of these motives and their passion, as Rashmi Agrawal says, to really think about some of these other attributes that are ingrained in the human capital. And I think, especially for this community, it would be really nice to think about how can we measure some of these other attributes that are not education or ability, and how can we think about conceptually about the implications they may have for various outcomes that we care about. So in that sense, you see the Google team. I hope all of us can be a team as well in studying human capital in general, especially startup human capital, and broadening the conceptualization of human capital to think about some of these motives that seem to be quite important. So thank you so much for sticking around, for listening. I see there are already some questions coming in, and I hand over to Sandy or Wesley to tell me who might have a question to share.
All right, thank you, Henry. So as you mentioned, we do have a couple questions in the Q&A. So why don't we go ahead with Jared, and we can unmute so that you can ask your question. All right, Jared, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, so go ahead.
Sure. So something I'm very interested in are entrepreneurial spin-out firms. And given the topics discussed today, it just occurred to me if you expect there to be unresolved research questions related to joiners launching companies of their own. I think I can probably come up with a few practical examples of companies that have done that. And I thought, where do you see this research stream going? If you just expand upon that, be great. Thank you.
Yeah, super interesting question. I kind of ran over a little bit, but I just pulled up again that slide from that second paper that we're currently working on, which looks at what's actually happening to these people who expressed certain preferences ex ante, and now we see them in the actual jobs. And just to kind of remind you that we did actually have quite a number of people who expressed the desire to found prior to graduation, but then they didn't found, but they actually went into firms. And these people are predominant, much more likely than others to go and work for startups, so become essentially a startup employee, even though their original preference type, if you want, was actually that of a founder. And that's consistent with some of the literature arguing that when you graduate, you typically don't have an opportunity that you would need to found a high-value startup, so you don't really have much of a choice than to work for someone else. But also that it may be strategically very smart for people who want to found to first learn how to do it. And you could learn some aspects of doing that by joining a startup that someone else has founded, and you essentially watch the founders. There might also be reasons for them to go into established firms because you want to get the Google label on your CV, you want to make a lot of money that you can then invest in your own companies. So I think clearly we do have people in the data that are actually interested in founding. And it will be nice as we continue to observe our panel of people over time to see whether a couple of years after these founder types have joined startups, whether they might actually be going out to found. The same thing is true for established firms. There's some founder types and joiner types who go to established firms, and it will be interesting to see whether they then also are more likely to launch startups on their own. So I think your question is really good in the sense of thinking more over longer periods of time, so to speak, and thinking not about a one-time decision, which is what we studied here, but to think about sequences. And that also relates to this literature that really thinks about career trajectories and entrepreneurial journeys over time. So I think there's definitely something in there. And much of, I think, the literature has focused on the knowledge that people acquire in the different types of firms. Again, here, it's an argument about the knowledge, but also that ex ante, they already come in with different kind of preferences. And maybe I should mention that as well. I think to some extent why we think this whole line of research on this sorting by preference is really important, because much of the literature is interested in the effects that you mentioned, right? You see a startup and then you see people leaving and doing something. And very often that's interpreted as a treatment effect, right? Because I've worked in a startup, they became entrepreneurial or they acquired certain, entrepreneurship skills to then leave. Our data suggests to some extent, these people are not just randomly assigned. They already had in mind the desire to found, and maybe that's why they went into a startup to learn, and that's why they then also found. I hope that kind of helps. But yes, totally interesting question. It should be looked at more.
Great. Okay, next up we have Brett. Right, Brett, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much. Thank you for your interesting research. I was really curious to know whether there may be a regional effect at work in your study, particularly where people who work in regions where there are a lot of startups are going to be more inclined to want to work in a startup compared to people who live in, cities or regions where they don't see a lot of startup activity.
Yeah. That would certainly be expected for two reasons. One, when you go back to the first paper I presented, which was about these ex ante preferences, that we already make very explicit at this point that a social context probably shapes preferences, right? So we talked about advisors who were founders, also the entrepreneurial norms in the departments. And I forget exactly if we looked at region effects in that paper, but it's reasonable to expect that, Stanford or so on has stronger entrepreneurial norms at the level of the department, which then would suggest that they should also be more interested in joining companies. What I do know that we looked at this in this particular paper that's still here on the screen right now, which is what actually happened, the paper. And there we have two reasons to expect such a region effect. One is, again, that different regions should have shaped entrepreneurial preferences to some extent, but also that different regions provide different opportunities to actually join. So if you're in Silicon Valley, there are many more startups walking around looking for employees, for example, or going back to the formal versus informal labor markets, it's much more likely you're going to run into someone who's looking for an employee from a startup in these entrepreneurial regions. So in that paper, we do look at that specifically. We look at entrepreneurial regions, primarily San Francisco Bay Area and the Boston area. And we do see that people in those areas are more likely to actually join startups. But even when we control for that, it does not mitigate the fact that people still sort by ability as well, which means even when you control for the fact that the Harvards and the MITs have high ability, and that the regions overall are more entrepreneurial, we still see these sorting effects by ability and preferences. But yes, certainly social context in general matters both in terms of shaping preferences, but also probably in terms of providing access to jobs. We don't. We have some measures in the survey. We don't have exactly what we would need to test this, but I think that's probably a good point.
Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, so Florence has a question. Let me. All right, go ahead.
Hi, Henry. Thank you for the great presentation. So you talked a lot about preferences, ability. I was also wondering, do you have some kind of socioeconomic information about those people? Because I can imagine that some people cannot afford the risk of working for a startup. So yeah, I was curious if that's a line of research that you looked at.
Right. Very good point. I'm just looking at the screen to look at the table. So we do have some information in the survey on parents, so whether parents were self-employed, and consistent with a lot of the other literature, we find that if your parents were more self-employed, you're more likely to actually express founder preferences yourself. We do see some gender differences. We don't have truly kind of income related variables, partly because these are PhD students, right? So it's not that they themselves have a lot of assets that we could have asked about. We did not, but maybe we could have asked about assets of the family or something, but to some extent, there's also an issue with asking these questions and not getting responses back. It could certainly be an interesting thought, running it parallel to obviously the founder literature, which has a very clear case that if you don't have the resources to found, either you do not have the money to found or you cannot afford the risk. To some extent, and actually reviewers also kind of pushed us on this one, is saying, well, the whole risk aspect, it's not really clear how bad the risk actually is in startups. And to some extent, it goes back to these region effects that were mentioned earlier, that there, you may know these stories about Silicon Valley being so productive and so vibrant, partly because the ecosystem itself creates a kind of a buffer, in the sense that if your particular startup goes belly up, you move across the street to a different one, right? I still think that startups are more risky, and even the moving costs are something that's not desirable from the employee's perspective. We also have evidence from a different paper that we wrote in 2010, where it's very clear that when you ask them, graduates what they think about startups and established firms, risk is the main thing they don't like about startups. So clearly it is risky, but it's not clear how big of a detriment it is, and particularly not clear if it's as important as a problem as it is for the founders, and related to that, whether income is as important. Because in our data, I mentioned it only briefly in this paper here, we do find that startup employees make less money, but it's not that they don't earn anything. So it's not that they essentially just pay out of pocket to found companies as we have it in the stereotype sometimes. These people do get paid, but it's not as much as others. And the risk aspect may or may not be dramatic, depending on maybe kind of what the outside options actually are. And remember, these people here in our data, they're all PhDs coming from top research schools, top being, kind of NRC ranked #1, which is, Michigan, Harvard, Duke, Wisconsin, and so on. So these people probably could find a job somewhere else if the startup doesn't work out. But in principle, I think your point is well taken. We should think about both the risk-bearing ability, but also the potential role of socioeconomic background. And again, we don't have the data to necessarily do it, but it's certainly an interesting question for future research.
Thank you.
All right, I think I'll jump in with the question. So Henry, this is really fascinating work. I was wondering, if there's further heterogeneity within the joiner type. So we might imagine that someone who wants to be employee #1 versus employee number 100 might be very different. So I'm curious if you, capture any of this in the data, or if you've seen this through kind of the survey results, because, there might be implications for what they decide to do next after this current company exits.
Yeah. It's a good thought. I mean, to some extent, one of the issues we are kind of keep thinking about is that we really talk about two different kinds of preferences, right? So we have these micro, as we call them, micro preferences, which is like how much do you care about autonomy, risk, income, and so on. And then we have these more global career preferences where we put people in these broader categories, right? Founder type, joiner types, and different types. Part of what you may be saying is that, well, the joiner types, there might be some who are kind of really, really high on the risk taking and some that are a little bit less high on the risk taking. And empirically, kind of the choice we have to face is, okay, do we want to deal with more well-defined buckets that we can, parsimoniously then relate to other things, or do we want to go into that underlying heterogeneity? And I think it really depends on the purpose of the study. For this one here, we thought it makes sense to use these career preferences, which are kind of the more aggregate constructs, because we can match it directly to the outcomes, joiner types, joining a startup, founder type, founding a startup, established firm types, established firm, employment. But for other research, it might make sense to go back to these kind of micro level preferences. And in some sense, that's what the third paper did when I looked at the performance inside these firms. I did not look at, are founder types more or less productive than joiner types. I looked at risk preferences. I looked at autonomy, responsibility, and so on. So I think once we move back to the implications of these preferences, maybe it's better to go to the micro level, which means we're looking at heterogeneity even within the types. But it's an interesting question. I think it depends a little bit on the purpose of the study. And I think that's a general challenge with papers, as many of you know, this kind of question of how much depth do you want to go into without losing the big picture view. For this one here, I think the types make sense. For others, I agree, heterogeneity would be really interesting, especially if you look at performance implications of mobility, for example.
Thank you. All right, I think we will wrap up the Q&A then. Okay, Wesley, would you like to close?
Thank you so much to everyone who's attending. Many thanks to Sandy for co-hosting, and Robin and Ryan for helping us with this session. Thank you so much, Henry, last but not least. And I'm sure Sandy will come up with a lot of very amazing scholars in the upcoming year. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining, and thank you, Wesley and Sandy, for organizing and hosting this.